Hi guys, I hope you're doing okay during these difficult times of working, and I hope you're good, you're safe anyway. And now we're gonna give a head start in the video classes as you've seen in the Dean's resolution. Today we'll talk about English word formation, how English became the language it is today. English is a language that has three different sources of vocabulary. One, the main one, is the Germanic, from the Germanic language. So it has a lot of Germanic vocabulary with words such as knowledge. But there is also the romantic vocabulary, which comes from Latin, and the Greek vocabulary as well, right? English is a West Germanic language, really closely related to other West Germanic languages such as Dutch, German, of course, Frisian, and Afrikaans, and less closely to North Germanic languages such as Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, and Faroese. On the other hand, when we think about how English became the language it is, we need to think about history. I know some of you are not so good at history, but mentioned before, you know, I've mentioned before that in 1066, England was conquered, invaded, I don't know, ruled anyway, for William the Conqueror, which was a Norman king, right? And was ruled for a long period after 1066. And this monarch came with all the nobility, and whose the native language of this nobility and monarch was a variety of French. And that's why we have uh, uh, so many words from Latin and from French in English. Even though this ruling group, the Normand group, eventually gradually went and switched to English, they started talking English for everyday purposes. French remained in use much longer as a language of law and administration, and longer still as a language of culture that every educated person was expected to learn. If you think about it, even here in Brazil, until the 19th century, French was considered a language of culture. Every highly educated person needed to know how to speak French. All the nobility, the rich families in Brazil used to send their kids to study in Europe and learn French. They used to learn French. So French is one of these so-called Romance language. All these Romance languages, they descend from Latin, like Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, Provençal, Romanish, which is spoken in Switzerland, Italian with all its dialects, and Romanian. Most words borrowed from French, therefore, they come from Latin indirectly. But Latin has a more direct influence too. The study of Latin was still a routine, part of what's considered a good education throughout the English speaking world until the second half of the 20th century. So until then, a lot of people used to study Latin. You need to always remember that. And as you've seen in morphology so far, many scientific words they come directly from Latin. Their formation is through Latin roots. So, particularly after the Renaissance or the revival of learning in the 15th and 16th centuries, it's not surprising that many words were adopted into English from Latin directly or by way of French. Uh, so that's how we started to have so many words. from Latin and from French in English. So remember the reasons. First of all, the Norman invasion in 1066. Second, uh, how French has always been seen as a language of culture until the 19th century, and how Latin was really important was considered important for people to study, and all the scientific vocabulary that is part of English comes from Latin. But we also have a contribution from the Greek language. Remember, first of all, Romans revered Greek culture, and most of classical Latin literature emulates Greek models. However, the Latin of the classical, the pre-Christian literature did not use many Greek words. They didn't use. The Romans preferred instead to create new Latin terms to translate the Greek ones. So Latin borrowings from Greek increased after the adoption of Christianity as the state religion of the empire in the 4th century. The possibility of direct Greek influence on English did not arise, however, until Western Europeans began to learn about Greek culture for themselves in the 15th century. From the point of view of word formation, the main influence of Greek has been in its use in the invention of scientific and technical words. Some of them come from Latin, some of them come from Greek, and many of the bound combining forms are Greek in origin. Do you remember bound and combining forms? Bound are those parts, those roots that are not independent words in English. They don't exist independently in the English language. For example, bio. Bio means life, and it's a root for biology, right? But there is bound root with a free form or a combination of bound roots, such as the word biology itself, right? Remember what we've studied before, okay? Don't forget, please. The variety of sources that contributed to the vocabulary of English accounts for the existence of many pairs or groups of words that are descended in whole or in part from the same ancestral morpheme in the extinct Proto-Indo-European language, from which Greek, Romance, and Germanic languages are descended, right? Remember, before all this is like the Bible, and then there was light, right? The beginning of everything is what we call, we at least we put as the Proto-Indo-European language that all, many, not all, but many languages are descended from. Um, so, words like these, they come from the same ancestral morpheme. They are cognate in the terminology of historical linguistics, but they have reached their contemporary English form by a variety of routes, through direct inheritance or through borrowing at different times. I hope you can see in the slides, but for example, let's think about the word heart, right? We have a Proto-Indo-European root from which the English word heart is descended. We have the, the root cord in Latin. This root cord gives origin to words such as cordial, right? Cordial, that exists in Portuguese. And the French word for heart is cœur, which originates in English, courage. How interesting, right? Um, it's funny how one tiny part, one root, one morpheme goes developing through history, through time, to become a new and completely different world. So you think about heart originated the word cordial in Portuguese through Latin, and through French, through the version of heart in French, word that it means heart in French, cœur, it started the word courage. I think it's beautiful because it means that when you are a cordial person, comes from the heart, and when you are a courageous person, it comes from the heart as well. So the actually this word courage was borrowed into English around, according to data, 1300. However, around 1400, the same root was borrowed again in its Latin shape as cordial, as I've mentioned before, the word cordial, with the meaning of belonging to the heart. So at first, when they started using the word cordial, it meant belonging to the heart. And later, it became, oh, a warm, friendly person. And yet, there is a fourth version of this root appearing in the word cardiac. Cardiac, cardiac, which was borrowed around 1600 from the Greek word cardiakos, pertaining to the heart, which now displays the root in Greek guise, card. So you see how amazing. We see two different origins, one from Latin and French, and the other from Greek, creating new words into English. Only about heart, for example. In terms of derivational morphology, we have many examples of how the influence of Latin and Greek can be felt in English. But in terms of inflectional morphology, this is a lot more rare. Remember that inflection is when you have the same lexeme in different grammatical contexts. So, one way in which a root can avoid appearing accompanied by an inflectional affix. At first sight, then it may seem that if English borrows a foreign pattern of word formation, it should be expected to borrow inflectional affixes that conform to that pattern, as well as roots, derivational affixes, but actually, this almost never happens. English doesn't use French or Latin inflectional affixes on verbs borrowed from those languages, for example. If you remember the inflectional affixes in Latin, I remember, guys, your studies from Latin, the inflectional affixes from Latin, there are so many, but English doesn't use uh, virtually any of them, right? The only condition under which English speakers are likely to borrow foreign word forms along with the lexemes that they belong to is if the grammatical words that the word forms express are few in number and so not so hard to learn. That's what I like about English. English is such an economical language. It's always trying to going for the easy way, right? And if the functions in English and source language correspond closely, this condition is fulfilled with nouns. So remember, English nouns have only two possible inflections, singular and plural, right? And if a noun is borrowed from a source language that also distinguishes singular and plural inflectionally, then the foreign inflected plural form may be borrowed too. This happens with the words. We have some examples involving Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Remember the cherubim examples we've seen? So, if you can look at the table on the slide, you see that this happens only with strict words from some words like from Greek, phenomenon in singular and phenomena in plural, schema in singular, schemata plural. From Latin, cactus in singular, cacti plural. Formula, singular, formulae plural. Datum, singular, and data. And the Hebrew words kibbutz, kibbutzing, cherub, cherubim. So you see, it's rare. It's very rare. There are few examples, and even that, even when it's so like such few examples, we still have sometimes uh, wrong uses of the right. People don't use the right form. You understand? For example, it's hard for you to see an every someone using cacti instead of cactuses, right? They try to apply the same pattern that already exists for the other words in English to the same. The same way happens with data. Data, it's normally used in singular and plural. I'm saying normally is because it's what people actually speak. Doesn't mean it's right by the grammar. While English doesn't borrow plural forms from French, there are some words borrowed from French which have the distinction between a male and a female form. Remember, English doesn't usually mark male and female. But for example, this happens with fiance and fiancée, which are words from French borrowed directly into English, right? So the reduction in inflectional morphology, as you can see in slide number 11. Well, modern English nouns have no more than two inflected forms, singular and plural. I've mentioned just right now. And in Old English, however, there was superimposed on this number a contrast of case, like that found in modern English personal pronouns, like we and us. For example, we discussed how in the end this was the same like seen, right? But in a more extensive way. This happened a lot in Old English. So Old English nouns could distinguish also the genitive or possessive case and a dative case, whose meanings including that of modern to in Mary gave the book to John. As you can see in this next slide, slide number 12, these two numbers and four cases yielded a pattern of 8 grammatical words for each noun. So you see how extensive it is. For example, the word name. In nominative, you have naman, naman, accusative naman, naman, genitive naman, namena, and dative naman, naman. I have no idea if I'm doing the right pronunciation here, as I'm not very familiar with Old English. But as you can see, it was an extensive inflection, uh, uh, right, for nouns. And right now, we only have singular and plural. And sometimes, as with fiance and fiancé, a distinction for male and female, but this with borrowed words. Um, as I was just saying about gender, male and female, in modern German or Russian, the same way as in modern German and Russian, Old English nouns they were distributed among three genders: the neuter, feminine, and masculine, which were grammatically relevant in that they affected the inflectional affixes chosen by any adjectives and determiners that modified them. Thus, it is this distinction between masculine and feminine that accounts for the different forms of the words meaning the and good in this. And once again, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. See good the good father, and see a good the mother, the good mother. So you see, we have different forms for the article the and for good, depending if it's masculine or feminine. The Old English verbs they displayed a similar inflectional luxuriance. I love this word. Most modern English verbs have four distinct forms, right? Inflected forms. We've seen perform, performs, performed, performing. While some common verbs have five, the irregular verbs, for example, speak, speaks, spoke, spoken, speaking. By contrast, the typical Old English verb lexeme, helpen, the old form of help, had over a dozen. distinct forms. We had an infinitive, helpen, a perfective participle, geholpen, and further forms, including those whose grammatical functions are like in the next slide. You can see, for example, one stands for the sound represented by the th in thin, and indicative and subjunctive represent a contrasting mood. You can see that better looking at the table in slide number 15. So look at that. How extensive, right? It was incredible. You have this looks a lot more like how Portuguese functions than how English functions now, right nowadays. It's so you had different forms depending on the person, depending on if it's indicative or subjunctive, singular, plural. See how extensive it is. And what are the characteristics of Germanic and non-Germanic derivation? For example, the Germanic root heart is free because it exists independently in the language, in the English language. We know what heart means. It's a word everybody uses, especially in romantic songs. It goes straight from the heart, right? Uh, Listen to your heart and whatever. But cognate roots, chord, that forms cordial, and card, which forms cardiac. They are borrowed from Latin and Greek. They are Latin and Greek. Sorry, they are bound. If this kind of contrast is general, then it has implications for inherited and borrowed affixes too. We will expect that native Germanic affixes should attach to free bases, while the affixes that attach to bound bases should generally be borrowed. And yes, this is correct. So usually the Germanic affixes, they are attached to free bases, to free Germanic roots, right? While the bound ones, they usually go to bound roots. For example, we have these Germanic affixes, ish, like bookish, greenish, ed, which forms the past, right? Visited, in, which forms the participle, broken, which is an agent, uh, dancer, hood, neighborhood, brotherhood, e as in doggy, let as in droplet, ship, friendship, and these y as in misty, right? And the Romance or Greek, Romance meaning Latin or French, and Greek affixes, Asian, Shan, or just Ian, N, and allomorph, Ian, Phi, and Phi, L, Ans, allomorph, Ans with an E, R, and the other allomorph, as, at, in, is, ism, ist, meant, and prefixes the and this. Okay? Some fashions in morphology, and that's what is interesting, because when you must think sometimes, why am I studying this? Why am I studying morphology? To understand English better, because wow, that's a great way to understand how English works better, how the words are formed in the language. I was studying French. I was like trying to use my time during this quarantine in the best way possible, learning French. And I was reading a text and I've seen a word, malheureusement. So I started dividing those words into the morphemes using my morphological knowledge. So I thought the root is heureuse, which is happy. Ment is like mente in Portuguese, the suffix mente in Portuguese, and the suffix li in English that forms adverbs of manner. So, heureusement, felizmente. But mal, this prefix is a negative prefix, like mal formado or something. So this is infelizmente. and I got the word right because I used the morphological process. I divided the words in the morphemes and everything that made sense, that had meaning, and was contributing to the meaning of the word. So even though I've never seen that word before, I was able to uh, guess its meaning using morphology. Always remember that. That's why it's so important. In some fashions in morphology, it makes sense to ask whether a certain word formation process, for example, a particular affix, let's say, is in or out of fashion. Aline, why I care about fashion? Well, there are, I'm using the word fashion here, but you could use the word trend. For example, sometimes there is a particular trend in morphology in the process of creating, coming up with new words. And self-appointed language pundits comment on such changes in linguistic fashion regularly in the media. However, nobody comments on fashions in how questions are formed or the structure relative clauses, for instance, because syntax is very stable. It's really stable in a way that morphology is not. So and believe it or not, it's not like I'm saying. So the process of forming questions never changed in the history of the word. No, it did. For example, in the past, the verb have used to be an auxiliary verb that worked a lot like the verb to be. And right now, in English, the verb have is the auxiliary verb only for the tenses of the perfect tenses, right? Past perfect, present perfect. But in the past, I could ask, "Do you have a dog?" And I could ask, "Have you a dog?" Like in the same way verb to be does. And of course, with time, this changed. But for example, we have this structure with the auxiliary verbs do and does. It's a very stable form, right? It changes very little through time. Morphology, it's different. It changes a lot with time. There are sometimes you see people using more one kind of word, and sometimes others. So you understand. In morphology, gaps get filled, or else gappy processes lose their regularity and survive only in a few lexically listed lexemes, like the process of forming abstract nouns by adding to adjectives, while other processes become increasingly regular to replace them. The conscious borrowings, for example, from Latin and to a lesser extent Greek, were fashionable in certain literary styles of the 16th and 17th centuries because of perceived need to enrich the English vocabulary. They wanted to write pretty, they wanted to write in a very interesting fashion. So that's why they used so many borrowings from Latin and Greek. But such borrowings, when you start writing and using words that are foreign, it's often obscure and sometimes even incomprehensible for some readers, to ordinary readers. So these writers were attacked as inkhorn, these words, sorry, they were attacked as inkhorn terms, the mere products of the pedant's desire to show off his knowledge of Latin. And the result is that the Latin and Greek derived element in the vocabulary of English has, since the 18th century, it has been pruned, it's been reduced rather than increased, right? Think about it. Even though we have many cognates that we still use in English, like important, right? But these borrowings, specific borrowings from Latin and Greek, they actually reduced rather than increased. Histories of the English language standardly draw attention to Latin derived words that used to be common but are no longer used, such as eximious. Think about it. And we have this word in Portuguese, exímio. Ele é um exímio esgrimista. I even talked about something that was very old to try to use the word. The word eximius means excellent, and also the word dimit, which means dismiss. One might have expected, therefore, that few new words forming during the last 2 centuries, apart from the technical terms. Remember, technical terms, scientific terms, usually involve combining forms, would contain Latin or Greek derived elements, but this is incorrect. We still have, to this day, people borrowing from Greek and from Latin. Since the 19th century, a small counter trend has set in, involving the Latin derived prefixes super and sub, right? As we've discussed, some of these uh, bound forms, these bound roots, they gained the status of free roots because they started to have meaning, independent meaning in the language, like super, like hyper, macro, micro, and mega, right? Words such as Superman, which was originally a translation by George Bernard Shaw of Nietzsche's German coin Übermensch, superstars, super rich, super cooling. These uses they illustrate they use with free Germanic roots of a prefix that was once typical with Latin derived roots, often bound, as in supersede and superimpose. Words such as hypersensitive, hypermarket, hyperactivity, as in the ADD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, uh, illustrate a similar tendency with Greek prefix meaning over, excessive, right? Once peculiar to combining forms such as hypertrophy. People who like to work out know what this means, hypertrophy. A more recent illustration of this trend has been the extension to free roots of Greek mega, so as to create megastore, mega merger, megabucks, alongside earlier words such as megalith and megaphone. A contributing factor, no doubt, is a desire to show one's awareness and understanding of new technical terms incorporating mega, giga, nano, right? All these terms about technology, gigabytes, megabytes, nanotechnology. They usually, meaning respectively million, billion, or thousand, or in nanogram too. So fashions in language are as hard to predict as fashions in clothing, right? But it will not be surprising if giga and nano soon acquire the same currency as mega, macro, micro, super, right? That became gained the status of free independent words. Headless or exocentric compound nouns such as redhead, lazy bones, and pickpocket, they don't reflect productive patterns in modern English. It would be a rash writer or speaker who coined a word such as climb rock or long neck, expecting the reader or hearer to interpret it unthinkingly as meaning rock climber or person with a long neck. However, right, it's not, I don't know if you understood what I meant right now, but it's like the same process of creating these words such as red hair, red head, lazy bones, pickpocket. It can't be just reproduced as I want it, I can just come up with a new word. But, however, there is another kind of exocentric compound noun involving verb and another verb or preposition, illustrated by words such as write off, call up, take over, break down, right? Meltdown, too. Usually, these can be related to phrasal verbs, right? Such as in they wrote those deaths off, as he was called up for military service, etc. However, compounds don't exist corresponding to every phrasal verb, right? I just can just start anyone. I have never encountered the hypothetical nouns give up, surrender, put off, postponements. Even this kind of exocentric compound, therefore, seems to be only marginally productive. Later, we will discuss more what is productive and what is not, but basically, what's more common, right? Yet, in the 1960s, we had there was a vogue, right, fashion for a class of compounds with the form verb and in. such as sitting, talking, loving, driving. Remember the kind of movie theaters outside, drive-ins, thinkings, etc. Conclusion. So, the characteristics of a language that are due purely to historical accident are the characteristics that, in principle, are least likely to interest a general linguist. The Norman conquest in 1066 is just such an accident, so its consequences for the vocabulary of English, the massive medieval intake of words from French, for example, may seem to deserve a place only in histories of the English language, not in books about its morphological structure. But there's more to it than that. If the history of the community of English speakers in the British Isles had been otherwise, the English language would be considerably different today, not just in its repertoire of lexical items, but in how its words are structured. For example, the use of combining forms. If we didn't have all this massive borrowing from Latin and Greek, we wouldn't have the kind of so many combining forms existing in English. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it wasn't so hard because, of course, we don't have the same way to take doubts immediately in this way I'm doing right now. But we'll set a date to take any doubts you can have about what I just explained. So stay at home, stay safe, and I hope real soon we can all get together again. Bye. I'm trying to close here. Me and computers. So you guys don't forget it. Oh, it's for me. Yes. Bye bye.